The following is an AZPM original production.
Welcome to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week, examining Arizona's 100-year water rule. For most of its existence, there has not been a lot of consideration by the general public of Arizona's rule that requires housing developers to show that a new subdivision has access to 100 years' worth of water. That all began to change last year, though, when new housing developments in the Phoenix area were put on hold while their supply was re-examined. Now the topic is hitting southern Arizona as the state re-examines the adequate supply designation given to a water company that covers much of the developable land in Sierra Vista. So how did this 100-year rule come into being? To start today's show, we ask one of its authors. Kathy Ferris is now a senior research fellow at the Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University. But more than 4 decades ago, she was one of the authors of Arizona's 1980 water law that set that policy in place.
In the days when we were drafting the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, there were some of us, myself included, who wanted to extend what is called the adequate water supply program, which was an existing law, and make it a permanent requirement in our active management areas. So an adequate water supply, the developer had to show 100 years of water, but he wasn't prevented from selling lots in the subdivision if he was unable to demonstrate 100 years. So the 100 years was just an arbitrary number that was picked decades ago when that law was enacted, and we just continued it. We thought, well, 100 sounds good. It's unique in the United States. I don't think there is another state in this country that has this requirement.
When you say it's unique in the U.S., is the water supply question unique, or is the 100 years unique, or both?
Both. The idea that you would require developers to demonstrate a 100-year water supply, I think we're the only state in the country that does that.
What was the reaction when this rolled out? I could see some developers saying, okay, that makes sense, and others saying, whoa, wait a minute, that's 100 years is not my problem.
Really, there wasn't a lot of reaction, and the reason was that the Groundwater Management Act ultimately was negotiated by the cities, the mining companies, and the farms, and developers were not in the room. And really, it was the cities and myself who were pushing for the assured water supply requirement, and the farmers liked it. They liked it because they said, if we're going to be limited in bringing new land into cultivation in active management areas, shouldn't there also be a prohibition on new development that doesn't have an assured water supply? So initially, the reaction was pretty muted. But over time, it became a real hot button.
I bet it did. And did the farmers ever say, I could see them saying, because so many farmers now have sold their farms and, as some people say, are now growing houses, that it helped them with those future plans because farmers know how much water they have. It's integral to their business. So did they talk about any of their future in that sense also?
Well, I think there was a feeling at the time that this would be good for agriculture because if they sold the land, they were selling the water supply to go with those houses. But in reality, a great deal of growth since 1993 has taken place on raw desert land. And that's because the legislature amended the laws then and said, well, we're going to allow you to use groundwater as an assured water supply if you join a district that is required to replenish the groundwater you pump. And so that opened up vast amounts of native land that had never seen any water use, to developments. And probably in the last 30 years, that's where most of these subdivisions have developed. Unless they're in a city or a town, such as Tucson, for example, that has been designated by the department as having an assured water supply. So most of our big cities, they have all demonstrated to the department that they have a 100-year water supply looking out for 10 to 15 years. And so if you're developing land that is going to be served by one of those providers, you don't have to take on the job of showing an assured water supply.
For a developer, does that 100-year math that they have to do to come up with the assured water supply, does it take into account what they're building? Townhouses that are xeriscaped versus a country club community that involves lawns and golf courses and things like that?
It absolutely does. So part of the process when they apply is they have to, give the department plat maps and tell the department what kind of housing they're building, what kind of amenities there will be. But yes, they have to do that. And then there are various calculations that they do or the department does to calculate the water use based on what they plan to do in that subdivision.
You and Sarah Porter were co-authors on a 2019 report that looked at the intended and unintended consequences of this rule. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about the unintended side?
So the report we wrote is on the Kyle Center website, and it's called The Elusive Concept of an Assured Water Supply. And it explores the role of the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District in an assured water supply. And that's the district I talked about that the legislature created in 1993. And if you enroll your subdivision in the district and you pay for replenishment charges, then you're allowed to pump groundwater. And the replenishment district has the responsibility to acquire renewable water supplies to replenish the groundwater you've pumped. Well, fast forward to, I guess it was 2019 when we wrote the report. That process, as I said before, that mechanism for developing subdivisions became the go-to way to get the water supply you needed and get an assured water supply for your subdivision. And it's created a big burden for this district because they are competing with many other water users for renewable supplies that they can use to replenish the groundwater pumped. And those supplies are becoming less and less because we have shortages on the Colorado River. Initially, it was thought that they could just use excess Colorado River water. And they thought they could do that till 2045. Well, fast forward, they stopped doing that in about 2014. So the projections for how much water could be acquired and replenished were awfully rosy. And they're going to struggle as time goes on to find the water supplies that are necessary for replenishment. And then in the meantime, they aren't required necessarily to replenish the groundwater where it's pumped. So you can be pumping in one location and have the replenishment take place in another location. Well, our aquifers are not big bathtubs. You could be creating a situation where the groundwater is pumped and it goes dry and the replenishment takes place somewhere else, but it doesn't help the folks that relied on that groundwater.
That was Kathy Ferris of the Kyle Center for Water Policy. You're listening to The Buzz. After the break, we hear about how this renewed fight over water supply could affect Cochise County's largest city. Stay with us.
No matter what happens in Washington, the NPR Politics Podcast is here for you. For the latest news, insights, and analysis from the election and beyond, listen to the NPR Politics Podcast.
Welcome back to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. We're looking at the state's rule that requires new housing subdivisions have access to a 100-year water supply. The bulk of Sierra Vista's developable land is in a planned housing development known as Tribute. The project has been slowly built out over years, though its owner, Castle & Cook, announced last year it would stop work due to market conditions. That stoppage may be prolonged thanks to a recent decision by the Arizona Department of Water Resources to review the adequate water supply designation for Pueblo del Sol, the water district that serves the subdivision. We asked ADWR and Castle and Cook for interviews to clarify the review, but neither returned our messages. The review came after the environmental nonprofit, the Center for Biological Diversity, sent letters saying a recent court decision about the San Pedro River makes the adequate water designation for Pueblo del Sol and others invalid. We spoke with the center's Robin Silver about those letters and the developments that have come along since they were sent.
The San Pedro is part of the Colorado River Basin because the San Pedro joins the Gila, which joins the Colorado. So as does the Santa Cruz. And so the entire basin is in trouble. It's in trouble for different reasons besides climate change, because we have a prolonged drought and now we're dealing with climate change. Tucson is a good example. They suck dry the Santa Cruz with their groundwater pumping. Then they bet their future on the Colorado River. They're going to have to reduce because if they go back on groundwater, you can't just keep sucking groundwater because the quality starts to diminish the deeper you go. With respect to the San Pedro River itself, I mean, please note the San Pedro River is the last surviving, free-flowing, undammed desert river in the entire Southwest. If you look at the rivers, if you're a neotropical songbird or you're just thirsty, the Rio Grande is dead. It's struggling. And then you start moving. The Gila's dead. The Santa Cruz is dead. The Colorado River is dead. The Verde still has some life in it in the middle. You know, it's at risk from Prescott's pumping. It also doesn't have the value in terms of international value where millions of neotropical songbirds are totally dependent on the San Pedro because it's the last bus stop during their migration. So it's a big deal beyond just the people in Sierra Vista are bummed out because they think, you know, it's all about them. Well, you know, they don't own the San Pedro. The San Pedro belongs to all of us.
When we talk about the river, how much of an issue, because the headwaters are not in Cochise County, the headwaters are in Mexico. So how much, when we're talking about a 100-year water supply for something in Cochise County or anywhere else in that basin, is it out of the state's control, Cochise County's control, the individual homeowner's control?
There's very little water comes from Mexico to the portion of the San Pedro in the United States. And so they're revising some of the numbers now. Emily Bregel did a story on it, looking in there because their wells are all going dry, mainly because of the Cananea mine. The river itself has always, the hydrology of the river is that the river actually, a good part of it starts on the west side of the Huachuca Mountains and flows south and then gathers water also from the mountains that are right next to Cananea. But most of that water doesn't cross the border. And not only that, it's been getting sucked dry for decades and decades because there's a well field that the mine has right along the border. So the areas that are watered in the U.S., that water is coming from the Huachuca Mountains, to a lesser degree, the Mule Mountains, which are Bisbee. And then there's gaining and losing reaches as it flows all the way to Winkleman. So some of the areas have always been historically dry and others are wetted. The problem in the United States is not a problem with Mexico. The problem in the United States is a problem with groundwater pumping in the United States. It's not been sustainable. The problem we have now is their deficit is about 2 million acre feet. The only thing that's going to work is that we need to drastically cut back on the groundwater pumping, which means downsizing of Fort Huachuca because they're the number one groundwater pumper in the area. Again, that's not new news. The Pentagon has had contingency plans for downsizing Fort Huachuca for decades.
And I would assume that would then trickle into downsizing Sierra Vista, since so much of the city's economy is tied to the fort. If there are fewer activities at the fort, there's probably less at Sierra Vista. So even more water saving would result.
I mean, Sierra Vista is Fort Huachuca. There's no difference between the two of them. If Fort Huachuca weren't there, Sierra Vista would be a tiny little town because there's nothing else there except maybe climate and tourism. But their entire economy is based on the military.
Is it a short-term or a long-term solution? Something that can be done tomorrow? Or is this something that we have to look at long-term? And as you said, with a 2 million acre-foot deficit, every acre-foot helps. Every drop saved is a drop saved. But is this something that can be made up over time? Or it's just too big and it's never going to be made up and people need to accept that and figure out the solution?
It's not too late. It's a long-term solution that we need to implement. But in the short term, we need to do something drastic because we're so far behind. It's no different than when you overdrawn your checking account. You can't just start over. You owe a debt, and physics is no different. However, the financial market will help correct the situation because just like in Florida, where nobody can get flood insurance for their homes, well, it's going to be the same thing in Fort Huachuca, Sierra Vista area. Is no one will be able to get financing for anything because who's going to invest in an economy that has no future? That's the short-term solution, and that has to be addressed. And it will be addressed no matter what the Army decides to do, because the Army's not going to be able to get housing for their troops. And so nor will the contractors, as more and more of the work is done by contractors, not by the enlisted personnel.
Is that why you all decided to start sending the letters to the mortgage companies and the realtors and all of that? Just kind of, some people would say that's a new tactic, going the economic route when dealing with water issues instead of the normal court routes and things like that.
Well, it's not that it's a new strategy. It's just that what we needed to wait for was the finalization of the adjudication lawsuit, because what was happening is that there was like fine print on all the financial transactions there that no one paid attention to, that basically said sometime in the future the water here might not be adequate. Well, no one paid attention. And so it wasn't like we knew it wasn't coming because we're in an overdraft situation. Well, now the situation's arrived, it's objective. And now the underwriters need to make a serious decision because their job is not to protect a river. Their job is to protect investors. And investors, most of them don't care about the environment, but they care about their wallet. And, the Fort Huachuca, Sierra Vista area is not a place to invest. It's not a place that you want to open your wallet for. And so that's happening now, and that's going to happen.
That was the Center for Biological Diversity's Robin Silver. We wrap up today's show by thinking about the city this impacts. Chuck Patusek is the longtime city manager of Sierra Vista. Our conversation starts with the origins of the city's water concerns.
There are a lot of different perceptions about water issues around the state, and each basin has its own individual, unique water issues, so you can't really lump everybody together. Ours is not an actual water supply issue. It's an issue of water usage as it relates to affecting the San Pedro River. So it's very much more a legal, regulatory type of issue, and the reality as to how much water usage affects the river.
And again, just so people have a little bit of understanding, setting this up, if people aren't familiar with Sierra Vista, why is the San Pedro so important to Sierra Vista and the surrounding communities?
Well, we're a very unique community in that regard. We're actually a community that sits in between two large federal properties, one being the San Pedro River. And of course, we have Fort Huachuca to the north and west of us.
So there's a common refrain that if a city isn't growing, the city is dying. Sierra Vista is one of those places that butts up against water issues and growth. It seems like almost the most, at least in our area. So how has guaranteed water supply affected Sierra Vista's ability to grow?
Well, we have lived with this for a very long time. So it's something we're used to having to deal with. I think another misconception that's out there is that Sierra Vista is not historically been a very fast growing community. We're, off the highway. We have no rail, being off the beaten path a little bit. You have to really want to be here or need to be here because of the Ford. So cars aren't lined up and down the highway, ready with anxious people to move into the community. And it's been that way pretty much the entire time I've been here. I've been here since 1986, and I've been city manager since January of 96. And it's been always a pretty slow and steady growth community. Over the last 10 years or so, though, it's been very, very little, 1% to 2%. So we haven't been too affected by the 100-year water adequacy as it relates to the growth rate and having the housing available and still having areas that can develop. Where it has affected us is primarily with our largest developer, which was Castle and Cook. And the tribute property that's been embroiled in some litigation that a lot of people are aware of. And that called for some 7,000 units to be built over a period of time, depending on market conditions. And that's really the largest growth area that the city has planned for the future. And then last year, Castle and Cook determined that they would pull out of the area, and as such, they're in the process of ratcheting down their operations.
With them pulling out of the area, what does the future look like, especially as ADWR says they're going to be reevaluating that 100-year adequacy for the water district?
Well, obviously, there's a number of other smaller properties that have been under development here in the area. So, that has been able to meet the demand so far. The question is, when those develop out, what's the future going to be like for development here in the area? Now, it's my understanding Pueblo del Sol Water Company, also owned by Castle and Cook, is the holder of the current 100-year water supply certificate. Now, in terms of how that harms Castle and Cook to then, go after the certificate again, could it mess up a potential sale of the property to somebody else or hold it up? That is something that could happen as a result of that. But I believe that Castle and Cook is voluntarily wanting to go through a review with ADWR, and then we'll just have to see what the determination is. Will it be zero, no growth? I don't anticipate that. Will it be amended to some other level of development in the future? That's highly possible. So really, we're in a position of having to wait to see what happens with that. Oddly enough, because this is tied into the Gila River adjudication and the determination by Judge Brain here recently with regards to what the federal water rights are for BLM and the river, that really hasn't been settled yet. That initial determination is out, but no decree has been issued yet. And there should be a number of appeals probably filed on that. So that's going to go on for quite a while yet as well. So I'm not sure if the threat of a suit is premature in that case or not. Obviously, 100-year water adequacy is a state issue, but obviously that could extend to a federal issue if suit is brought against BLM to enforce their rights as well in the future.
The environmental group that lodged the complaint about adequate water supply for the land in question has a number of complaints running in Cochise County. some of them near Sierra Vista. When these type of complaints come up, do you as city manager or the city get involved with talking with these environmental groups, or is that between the courts and the developer and the environmental group, and the city just tries to stay out?
Well, generally, all they bring to the table is litigation. So there usually is no discussion or, negotiations or anything like that. Obviously, we've been engaged in water issues here for, ever since I've been here. And certainly we work with many, many different groups, federal agencies, state and local agencies, as well as nonprofits and NGOs. So we have three different major water groups that we're a part of. So we participate in all of those efforts to help, protect the river, as well as the jobs on Fort Huachuca. And we continue to do that. And then we just, end up having to see where the courts rule and then adapt to whatever landscape is presented to us.
It sounds like all of this is, especially since you've been on the job since 1996, nothing new. It's just a continuation of the same issues.
Yeah, nothing new, really. I mean, all of this really started with, the Center for Biological Diversity using the Endangered Species Act, dragging Fort Huachuca into those efforts. And of course, Fort Huachuca being a national defense asset and of course our largest employer, we're certainly going to be very interested and involved in anything pertaining to the fort. And of course, we have the river here, and nobody wants to see that, damaged as well. So we kind of have to walk in the middle and try and make sure that everything is satisfied on both ends.
That was Sierra Vista City Manager Chuck Patusek. And that's The Buzz for this week. You can find all our episodes online at azpm.org and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for The Buzz Arizona. We're also on the NPR app. Zach Ziegler is our producer with production help from Desiree Tucker. Our music is by Enter the Haggis. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for listening.
AZPM's original productions are made possible in part by the Community Service Grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by donations from listeners like you. Learn more at support.azpm.org.